Hi, welcome to The Same Drugs. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Megan.
Um, I'm really looking forward to talking to you. I've been following your work for some time now, and I find it brilliant.
Well, I can say the same for you. Absolutely. I'm really, really pleased to be able to have this conversation with you.
Um, how have you fared in 2020?
Hmm. Uh, I'm doing okay, actually. I feel very lucky, quite blessed. I have the benefit of, a family and a home situation that is loving and that is stable. And my husband, whom you have interviewed on your podcast, Bret Weinstein, and I started our own regular podcast right as COVID was causing lockdowns, and it quickly became really popular. So it gave us a way to reach out into the world and to feel useful and valuable while speaking truth, which is, boy, what better, right? I know that you are familiar with the wonderful feelings of being able to be of use and of not compromising your values while doing so. So yeah, I am in so many regards just doing really terrifically, and at the same time, uh, really ready to be done, really ready to be traveling. You and I were talking about this a little bit off air. I've never spent so much time in one place before as an adult. I am accustomed to both traveling for work, for speaking gigs and such, but also for my field work in the past, and more recently, sort of leading study abroad and doing just getting out into deep nature. And Brett and I were very lucky to go to the Amazon a year ago now. We were actually in the Ecuadorian Amazon in January of 2020. And so I got it was only 2.5 weeks, but one last trip in before all of this happened, before anyone knew. Like, we literally emerged from the Amazon and spent a couple days in the Andes. And when we were in the Andes, we started to hear about this strange new virus that was just emerging from China and had shown up in Ecuador, and people were going to be masked at the airports. And that was when everything started to change for everyone. So all in all, this has been so hard on everyone, and I feel like almost everyone has had a harder time of it than I have. So I'm lucky.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important to, I suppose, count our blessings. I mean,
Yeah.
I like you two now, in any case, I'm lucky to be able to work online and to continue doing things that I feel passionately about and interested in, and at the same time I hate that everything is moved online. I mean, I've sort of always worked online, but I think that people might assume, well, you're a writer, you're used to being at home alone all the time. But in fact, I really wasn't. I was constantly, I would have meetings, events, I would socialize all the time. I mean, the only way you can balance, from my perspective, working online and working from home is by having like an external life that is of equal proportion, I think. And
Absolutely. I mean, this is the image that I at least have in my head from, like, the big 20th century writers. People, who would spend, get up in the mornings, often hungover, right? These are like hard drinking louts, most of them, right? And they get up and they write, and then they go out and socialize, walk into the city where they live, whatever it is, or walk into nature, or both. And um, each day that combines some of those two activities, one very solitary and internal, and one very outward facing and experiencing the world, be it social or natural or some combination of the two, is really a beautiful day. And also the way that we generate our ideas, and how it is that we have something to write about in the first place. So this humans can't put up with this kind of lockdown forever, and it among so many other things, it will just render us less and less able to make sense of our own experiences, because it's too depauperate.
yeah, I agree. I mean, the balance aspect is really missing from our lives now, especially as we've been forced online, and a lot of people are working online, but it's not just that, it's that we're so dependent on social media, of course. And social media, I think we all know, or we all should know in any case, that social media is bad for the brain. It's bad for our mental health. It obviously has uses. It's useful, but I think that the way that we use it is not super healthy, and the way I use it isn't even super healthy. And I'm aware of the fact that it's not good for me to be scrolling all day
Right.
long, and yet when you're sitting in front of a computer, it's hard not to do that. And in the past, as somebody who's faced controversy online, as you have, and I have also, the way that I've coped with that, I mean, I don't know if people ask you this question. People have asked me this question, like, how do you manage the stress of
Hmm.
being attacked online constantly or whatever? And I used to say, oh, I go meet a friend at the bar, or I
Yeah.
leave, like I leave the country, like, or I leave and go to the island, like I take myself physically away from the couch and the computer.
Yeah.
And I can't do that anymore, and it's really hard.
Yeah. No. So even if it doesn't go into the realm of addiction for many of us, although for many of us it does, your description of it fits perfectly. You can know consciously that it's not good for you, and yet still have a very difficult time pulling away. And you can know what you intend to do when you sit down at your device, and still say, "I'm just going to check that thing first." And yeah, I had literally never been on social media before my life and my husband's life blew up when Evergreen exploded in May of 2017. I had explicitly and intentionally avoided it. And I had long conversations with my students. This is when I was a college professor, and with Bret. And at that point, I have two teenage boys, so they were young enough that there was they simply weren't on at all at that point. And so I didn't have to have the difficult conversations there. But I'm only on Twitter, and um, and I actually find that it is, yes, just as bad as I was expecting, but it's also so much better than I was expecting. And no, those things don't happen simultaneously, right? You don't get the exalted highs and the depraved lows at the same time, but there is really a lot that can be done and can be shared. And there is the capacity for community, which I didn't actually think was possible. So
Hmm.
that, how can we bring more of that into our social media experiences, and focus less and spend less time in the depraved part? It's a challenge, and there's not going to be any stable answer. You can't just set and forget an answer and be like, and I'm done, and now I'm done with that part, and it's all going to be sunshine and roses from here on out. No, you got to keep
Yeah.
on moderating it.
Yeah, you need to set boundaries for sure. I mean, the other problematic aspect of our dependence on social media, and I know you and Brett have talked about this, is the algorithm, and the way the algorithm functions and dictates in many ways what we see, like the information we have access to, the ideas we have access to. It
Mhm.
shapes our view of the world in many ways now. If you're dependent on social media for your information, you're going to think, oh, I mean, everyone voted Democrat.
That's right.
Everybody
Yeah.
hates Trump. Everybody believes this.
Mhm.
Everybody supports the vaccine. Everybody doesn't support the vaccine. Depending on your bubbles, your worldview and your opinions are going to be so shaped by what you see. And I mean, I know that you and Brett, many of your discussions have centered around concern. I was going to say fear, but let's say concern that the algorithm kind of might take you out, right? Like if you if
Yeah.
you if you say the wrong thing, if you discuss the wrong thing on your channel, the algorithm might decide to just
Yeah,
erase you.
or the algorithm, or some kind of low-level staffer who's too woke for their own good, who's making the decision that now we've gone a bridge too far. Now we're actually talking about whatever it is. Did COVID start in a lab? How how many vaccines are there and how excited should we be about all of them, or can we have nuance and think about them differently, right? Frankly, what took you out, I think, is maybe most likely, if I have my druthers in terms of what I'm talking about, to be the thing that I step over a line on, because the trans rights activists are in some ways even more confusing to the mainstream. Like there's somehow very few people seem to be able to stand up even to the most ridiculous statements, like like men aren't women, right? And I say that as someone, and I get tired of saying this, like, I believe trans is real and I have trans friends and all of this, but the vast majority of things that are passing for reasonable discourse in that space right now are batshit crazy. And I, as a scientist and a humanist, and in the last decade or so, I've been harder pressed to call myself this, but I certainly always used to call myself a feminist, want to be able to talk about all of these things. And the idea that we might get censored because it doesn't suit the current fashion of someone who is making decisions, editorial decisions in social media, well, that's not okay. And I guess one other thing related to what you were saying, when you read, I subscribe to the New York Times still, and have for decades. And when I read the New York Times, I know that it's edited, right? Like, I know that there's a bent. I know that there's an editorial slant, and I'm ever more dismayed at how much more edited it seems to be than it used to be. But I also go in knowing, and I imagine that I don't watch Fox, but if you watch Fox, if you read The Guardian, if you listen to NPR, whatever it is, CBC, going in what kind of biased filter you're already getting. Whereas when you are on social media, I think we all have the sense, even though we know it's not true, that we're getting the whole gamut. Like we're getting what humans are thinking, and no, because the algorithms are hidden from us. There is no editorial board. There are a series of algorithms feeding us things that it thinks are like the other things that we have already decided to watch or listen to.
Yeah. And I want to get into all of those subjects that you brought up, the vaccine, the gender identity debate, feminism. But what do you think do you think there's a grand plan that Twitter has in terms of what kind of information they allow on the platform, who they ban, what they censor? Or do you think that it's sort of more random than that? Do you think it's like, employees who have biases, who are like, I don't like Megan Murphy, gonna take her out? Like, is it organized, or is it sort of so disorganized that these things are happening and no one really knows what is going on enough to control it? I mean, it is weird that none of us know the rules. It's weird. It's not weird. Right. It's completely unfair and I think dangerous, but I didn't know that I was doing something wrong. I think people thought that I was antagonizing and poking, and they were like, well, you shouldn't have kept doing that. Like, you're trying to stir up controversy. And when I was banned from Twitter, I was shocked. I was like, what did I literally started crying. Because I was scared. Like, I was like, I'm independent. So this is where my audience is. This is how I work. And I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Right. And I've sort of managed to figure it out. It still impacts me really negatively. Now I'm dependent on Facebook and I hate Facebook. But anyway, do you think that there is do you think that there's a plan? Do you think there's an intention? Do you think that it's like Twitter corpse bias, or is it something less planned out than that?
Yeah, I think, well, and originally you had framed it as like, is it organized from on top, or is it sort of random? And I think, I wouldn't say random, but I think there's sort of an intermediate possibility. And I wouldn't say there's no chance that there's a big organizing principle in place, but I think it's much less likely than that there are, it's more like sort of backroom conversations, the smoke-filled room sort of thing, which as the results of those conversations become more and more manifest in the world, those people start to connect with one another. And, and we end up seeing connections that may not have existed prior to them meeting publicly, but then they become more powerful as a result. So, the TRAs, the trans rights activists, are very, very powerful at this point. But I don't think, and I may well be wrong, but I have not seen any evidence that there was, some massive top-down move from anyone to basically to confuse the issue, right? To make this incredibly tiny population of people with a very unfortunate condition into a totally different thing that is politicized and reality denying and destroying people's lives, from homosexuals to women to children, all of this. I haven't seen any evidence that that's a top-down thing, but I do think it's becoming more and more powerful. And so, it's also not random. It's evolutionary. And, that's always going to be my bias, as it were, as an evolutionary biologist, but it is. There are selective forces in play. And the fact that that one in particular, the trans thing, got framed as a civil rights issue, and all the good people, all of us good liberals, and frankly, most of the good conservatives too, right? We're like, oh, well, I know that I have to be on board with the next civil rights issue because that's what we do, right? That's obviously what we do. Women got the vote and Black people got the vote and gay people got to be married. And like, we just keep on marching forward. This is what progress is. And framing it that way just confused so many people. And now a lot of people who came out publicly in defense of something which clearly isn't making sense are going to have a hard time rejecting their own previous positions, because it's hard to say publicly, I was wrong, right? It's easier to say publicly, I was wrong, if your previous wrongness was a privately held position. But once you've said something publicly that you have to rescind, it's even more challenging, and made more so. I mean, this is where the social media mobs, make it even harder. That they will come for you, and for almost anything. Actually, my brother-in-law, Eric Weinstein, who also has a podcast, brilliant man, refers to this as the foot fault. Like, when you are going up against whatever it is, the forces that be, the powerful, the activists, whatever it is, and they are amassing forces against you, Megan, me, Heather, whoever you are, have to be perfect. And it's a standard that isn't fair, but you're not even allowed a foot fault, like in tennis, right? Like, if you make even a foot fault, you're out and you're done and you're canceled and it's over. And the idea of sort of threading this needle super, super carefully, while not making any errors of any sort, well, we're all human. And, of course we'll make errors. That just is going to be the case. And we have to be able to be wrong sometimes too. Like, we have to be able to take risks in our own thinking and go, oh, I think maybe this. Oh, it turns out not that. Turns out I learned something new, or just my thinking was an error. Like, that's gotta be okay. Else we're not living our best lives, and we're not going to be doing the best by other people either.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny how many people are averse to doing that. I mean, I feel like I mentioned this to you earlier before we started recording, but I've changed my mind about a lot of things over just the past couple of years, and I've been talking about it publicly, and I don't feel embarrassed about it. I feel proud of it. Like, first of all, I enjoy changing my mind about things, not because I'm like a flake and I just change my mind about things on a date. I was like, now I like this. But it's because I've learned something new. So it's, I've had conversations with people, I've read new articles, I've looked at new research, I've looked at new data, I've just seen something from a different perspective, and therefore I've changed my mind. And that's how we should change our minds. If we learn a new thing and we're provided with new information, we should be able to change our minds and say so. But people seem you know, I think it's almost that people don't even want the information that might lead them to change their minds.
It's harder, right? Like it's easier to set and forget, to have brand loyalty, to have idea loyalty, to be like, this is what I think, this is who I am. I'm a liberal Democrat who will always vote Dem, who, as an American, who will always do this. And when you start to say, actually, no, not only am I not seeing in them, for instance, what I was seeing before, but also they too were changing. So, especially when, if you're just talking about like, voting, and say you had party loyalty and you're expected to have party loyalty forever. Well, that does not only preclude the possibility that you yourself will change, but what about the party? What about the politicians themselves? If their politics are changing, and we know that the parties change, then why on earth should you have loyalty? Well, it's easier to do it, right? Like I say that as someone who finds personal loyalty one of the highest values. Like I feel very strongly about personal loyalty, but loyalty to an entity, to and it's, especially something that simply wants my vote and has, very rarely is interested in actually giving anything back. I think there is exactly no reason to simply have loyalty for the sake of having loyalty, but it is easier. It is the easier path, and I think that's part of what drives people, is just saying, you know what, I always buy this kind of toothpaste, I always vote blue, I always, buy this kind of car, and these are the kinds of friends I have, and these are the routines I have, this is the way I drive to work. All of these things, it's just easier to have the patterns, have the habits, but it is, much more interesting to go outside of them. And I think we need balance, right? Like you and I talked about, we both miss travel. And I know any day where I am standing in a place where I've literally never stood before is just glorious for me. I love having literally the new perspective of, I've never seen this before. I've never experienced this thing before. And you can get that if you go to the same place at a different season or a different time of day, a little bit, but actually being in a new place is just life-giving. But you can want that and not want that all the time. You can also want, the security and comfort of your own home and be able to play those two off one another. There's a tension between wanting the familiar and the patterns and the habits, and also wanting to explore and be adventurous and figure out, poke at your own ideas and beliefs and see where you were wrong. We should all be able to value both of those things without taking crap from one side or the other when we either do something that they weren't expecting us to, or we also stay at home in some familiar way and say, yeah, actually, I'm comfortable with this for a while. All of those sorts of behavioral modes are acceptable and should be affirmed.
I wonder if this is about, I mean, that particular kind of loyalty. So whether it's brand loyalty or loyalty to a particular political party, loyalty towards, the left, for example, or the right, ideological loyalty. Is this about, I wonder if it's about tribalism, and therefore if it's sort of something that's natural or innate to human beings that we can't really avoid on a certain level.
Well, it is, finding your group certainly has been for, since long before we were humans, since we've been primates. Primates are social. And I don't know that our most recent common ancestor with all the primates was, but call it at least primates. We're talking about 100 million years of social life. So once you're social, yes, you have affiliation, and yes, you're territorial, and yes, you have sort of a kind of tribalism that's there. But as humans, we also have, on top of all of that, long evolved sociality and tribalism, an ability to look around and make decisions that sort of overlay the tribalistic impulses and say, actually, I can feel a sense of belonging in this group over here and also this one, even though the overlap between these two groups may be scant, or even if I'm the only one who says I want to be in group A and group B because I see interesting things in both of them. And so, yes, it's not super easy to try to turn around your sort of the tribalistic impulses, but we can do it because we have consciousness, because we have these giant frontal lobes that we're carrying around on our shoulders, and we can use them to reflect on our past and think into the future and care about other human beings really deeply, and understand that just because I believe something and I saw an event over there, if you saw the same event, you may have seen it differently, right? There is some underlying reality that is unchanging about the history of all events and the universe, but our perspectives on it are different, and therefore we can actually really come away with different interpretations even of the same things, and that's okay. And that doesn't inherently make me bad or you bad if we come away with different interpretations.
Yeah, well, it should be okay.
Yeah, it should be, right?
I mean, I've noticed this happening around the COVID conversation, right? So in Canada, at least, it may be playing out differently in other countries, but in Canada, it seems that there's been a division, or at least it's represented to be a division between the right versus left. And if you're on the left and you're progressive, you support all of the lockdown measures. You're excited about the vaccine and you're not going to question the vaccine, and you're pro-mask, you wear a mask all the time, you put your social media profile pic up with yourself in a mask. And if you're on the right, you hate masks are oppressive, and the vaccine is dangerous, and also all the lockdowns are bad. And so I don't have some like hard and fast position. I've just been learning as we go along, right? Like early on, I was like, yeah, lock down, get rid of the virus. And then it kept going on. And I was like, I don't think this is great. Like, I have some questions. I don't know if this is the necessary choice or the most healthy choice for society or the economy. I want to think critically about all these things, and just sort of asking questions, questioning the dominant narrative. You're pegged as right wing or alt right. I see people online saying, "Oh, Megan's an anti-masker. She's gone right wing," and I'm like, "Did I say that? Did I go? What do you mean by right wing anyway?" It's like I don't recall that, but okay. And I know I'm wondering, because I know that you have talked about the lab leak theory, and as far as how this virus escaped into society. And I wonder, well, first of all, if you can explain why you believe that versus like the wet market theory or whatever else, the bat theory, and what the reaction has been like to you talking about that.
Yeah, well, boy, there's hours and hours of Bret and me talking about this, so I will gloss over as much as I can really quickly. Really, as COVID emerged, excuse me, and Bret and I, so we're both evolutionary biologists. We're not virologists, we're not public health experts, we're not epidemiologists, but we're evolutionary biologists who have traveled a lot, who are probably more vaccinated than just about anyone else, because we travel in such deep nature that we've got things like yellow fever vaccinations and rabies, because we've worked with bats. Actually, Bret worked on bats, so we started looking at what was going on as it was emerging in March. And actually, before anyone else was talking about it, and indeed at the point that the WHO and the US Surgeon General were saying, masks don't prevent anything, you should not be wearing masks, we were wearing masks to the supermarket and the hardware store and getting crazy looks and getting lots of suspicion. And these, because of where we live, Portland, Oregon, and where we shop, these are good liberal neighbors of ours who are like, what the hell are you doing wearing a mask? Are you sick? Like, no. just trying to figure out what's going on, and this feels like the safest route. And this is actually our private conversations about COVID and masks were what prompted us to start the live streams that we started doing in late March, precisely because it felt like we could reveal to a lot of people what a conversation between two people who were smart, who were scientifically savvy and biologically savvy, but not in any way expert on this particular topic, what those conversations would sound like as you tried to figure out what was true, as it was already becoming totally clear that things were being politicized. Like literally, the WHO and the US Surgeon General were saying masks don't prevent transmission of what was already pretty clear was an airborne virus. Like, I can't even imagine what world that could be true in. And sure enough, it turned out to be a political move, right? This was about protecting the supply of PPE for the frontline health workers who were really going to need them. And that may be an honorable goal, but lying to the public about efficacy of mask wearing, well, guess what? Of course it backfired. So at the point that now everyone has to be wearing a mask when you're out in a public place, inside with strangers, a lot of people rightfully said, why the hell should we trust you? Like, why are we supposed to believe you now when, was it last week you were telling us exactly the opposite? So one of the things that has been totally revealed by COVID-19 and by almost all of 2020, and now we're into 2021, is this is why having an ideology that is a received wisdom where I just trust those authorities cannot work as you try to navigate this hyper novel world we're in, because there's simply no way to put together the WHO's position previously, in February about masks and the WHO's position in March and since about masks. You cannot do it. And so you have to say, okay, well, there's politics involved. If I just want to stay at the level of trying to keep myself and my family and my loved ones safe, what am I going to do? So, we've been pro-mask and actually pretty like hardcore lockdown, like harder core than we actually had, which is part of why probably they didn't work from an early date, but never pro the kinds of policies that actually got manifested where, for instance, the beaches were being closed down, the parks were being closed down, the hiking trails are being closed down. Oh my God, this is insane. There is good evidence. Like there's a lot of really good research actually on this virus doesn't transmit outside. Now, could it start to? It could. It's evolving. We know this. Of course it is. It's a virus. It's going to evolve. But at this point, we see no evidence it transmits outside, and shutting down access to these outdoor areas exactly when you're shutting people into their homes, and even people without any history of mental health problems are going to start to develop, mental health problems. Help them get outside. Help encourage everyone to get outside and be using the public space that is our right. And not only doesn't the virus transmit outside, but being outside in the sun is actually curative. Like, vitamin D and sun on our skin is actually, for mechanisms we don't fully understand, helpful against the virus. So, that's all, that is simply all true. And so, we've had these firm, based in what we understand, we being Bret and I, or my husband and I, conversations, first twice weekly and now weekly since March of 2020. And people and on social media in particular keep trying to slot us into, oh, you're pro-mask. Well, then you're one of those, libtards. Oh, you're questioning whether or not a brand new technology for a vaccine can be safe. Oh, well, then you're alt-right. It's like, actually, no. We're still liberals, always have been, like, actually, quite progressive politically, but I'm not accepting the slate of wisdom from people who have demonstrated that they don't know what they're doing and they're willing to politicize everything. So just one thing about the lab origin hypothesis, which is, I think I won't get into the various evidence that we had a lot of conversations about it, and Bret also had a really good long conversation with Yuri Dagan about it, who has dug into the evidence. Whether or not it came from a lab, when we started to talk about it in April of 2020, some of the pushback we got, of course, at first was, if you talk about this, you are right wing, which is insane. If you talk about something, it makes you inquisitive, and if you talk about it in a certain way, it makes you scientific. It doesn't make you inherently left wing or right wing. But because the mainstream media was trying to shut down those conversations and basically saying, if Trump says it, then if you say anything like it, then you're right wing. Like, this is not how logic works. This is not how reality works. I don't like the guy either. That doesn't mean he's wrong all the time. Like, it's just not the case, right? So the fact is that it was one of the things that came back at us was, why does it matter? Why would you possibly talk about that, given that what we have to do is shut down the virus? And suddenly we're exactly in my wheelhouse and Bret's wheelhouse. And that wheelhouse is, it's evolutionary. If that virus emerged from a bat, escaped from a bat in a wet market, and jumped to humans, it is likely to be doing different things as it spreads across the world than if it was actually created in a lab. And so there's a third hypothesis, which is like an intentional bioweapon, an intentional leak. And I've seen no evidence for this. I don't think this is true, but that would be a third avenue. But this thing that the evidence I've seen suggests is likely is that there was research, legitimate, hopefully good faith research on how viruses evolve and how we might deal with pandemics should they emerge on viruses, and there was an unintentional leak. Well, if this virus has been created with, in a lab by humans, in research conditions that are exactly conducive to increasing transmission, that's going to change how this virus transmits in the rest of the world. And therefore, we could be making predictions, public health level predictions. We, being like public health people, could be making different predictions about how it is that it's going to spread, and in what ways it's going to mutate, and whether or not it's going to become more virulent, like this UK strain has just emerged, or take a lot longer to adapt to humans, which is what you would have thought if it had really just jumped from bats. And it doesn't seem to have taken any time at all getting used to humans, which is part of those sort of the non-molecular evidence for why it seems like it's likely to have come out of a lab, but not not intentionally, not as a bioweapon, just as an escape from, again, hopefully a well-monitored lab that made a mistake.
Right. I'm curious also to know if you think, so the vaccine's coming, it's here, it's just not being dispersed yet throughout the general public. But do you think, I think that there's a lot of people who are like, the vaccine's here, we're saved, everything's resolved, now we can go back to normal. Do you see the vaccine as the solution, the savior?
I wish I did. I wish I did, and it's possible it will be, and I hope that's true. So there are at least 3 vaccines that are really actively now. I think 2 of them, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, are out, and there's some more that are in development. And the 2 that are being distributed, at least in the U.S. and I think in Canada as well, are both using a technology, using mRNA, that has never been used in a human vaccine before. And maybe it's totally safe. Maybe it's even safer than the technology used and the mechanism of action of traditional vaccines. That would be awesome. But we literally just have no way of knowing. And when I say that, I am not saying, therefore, it's not safe. Of course not. We just don't know. There is literally no way for us to know because it has not been around. And so, if another virus emerges in 5 years, and some will, that'll happen, and there is another really quick creation of an mRNA vaccine at that point, and these mRNA vaccines proved to be both effective and safe, in that only a very, very, very tiny percentage of people who got the vaccines suffered side effects that were in any way onerous, then in 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, I will have much less skepticism about a new mRNA vaccine, because the technology that is being used to develop it and the technology that it is using within the human body has at that point had some years of effectively time to be revealed as to whether or not it's safe. So we don't have that time. I'm grateful that I'm grateful for the technology, and I'm glad that a lot of people are going to get access to it. I really am hoping for a relatively quick deployment of a traditional vaccine, which I would be at this point more comfortable taking, simply because we have decades and decades of research on traditional vaccine technology.
Mm. I wanted to talk to you about this this trust the science mantra that we've been hearing. I think it came from the climate change conversation. I
That may be
think
true.
that's
Yeah.
yeah, I mean I haven't
Yeah.
looked into it too deeply. It's just that's where I first recall hearing it, where people would respond trust the science to climate change deniers. Again, that's a binary conversation that shouldn't necessarily be a binary conversation, but
Absolutely.
well, let's talk in Twitter language, I guess. But so trust the science, plucked from the climate change debate,
Yeah.
has been applied to all sorts of things, including the COVID conversation. Somebody will just shout trust the science at you without actually offering any science. And
Yes, they will.
and oddly, it's also being applied to the gender identity debate. So, when you start talking about biological sex, which is mostly like there's two main aspects to the debate as far as I'm concerned. The aspect of biological sex, which is real, and what a woman is and what a man is, and then the political aspect, so the women's spaces aspect.
Yep.
But when you talk about the biology aspect, and you say, for example, you can't, if you're born male, you can't become female. People will start yelling at you about science, and like the scientists disagree, and like, do they? Have they disagreed?
Right.
And I know you've gotten into this debate. I don't know if you wanted to get into this debate, but you ended up in it. What was the thing that you said, or the conversation you were trying to have, that caused controversy for you?
Well, I mean, I think in some ways this is exactly my wheelhouse. Like this is the hill I'll die on, and I really hope I don't die doing it, because boy, how stupid if you die claiming that male and female are real. Right? Like that suggests a real problem with society, which, yes, we know we're having that problem. So my background is as an evolutionary biologist. I study sexual selection. I study the evolution of reproductive success, of territoriality, of parental care, of mating systems, of social systems. And yes, most of my empirical research has been on poison frogs in Madagascar, but also on primates and also on humans. And so like the book actually that Bret and I have just finished writing is sort of all of this in humans, as opposed with examples from other animals as well. And so I used to teach when I was a college professor for 15 years, and I taught vertebrate evolution and I taught animal behavior. And a lot of what that meant was just because of my interest. I was more interested in sex differences and sex roles and sexual behavior and mating behavior than I was in like foraging behavior, like what they eat. I'm more interested in why they like who they like and what that means for the relationships in the future than I am in whether or not they eat leaves or fruit. So I would end up in conversations with students who increasingly, so my years teaching college were between 2002 and 2017, and I did begin to get sort of more and more radicalized student pushback to some of what I was saying, but it never persisted. I remember the very first time I was talking about sex roles, which is what we call gender when it's not humans. And I said, I can't remember exactly what I said, but some students said, oh, you just said sex, don't you mean gender? And I kind of, I brushed them off. I said, it's the same thing. And I actually, 6 months later or so, I had kept in touch with a student. I went back to them. I said, I was too brusque with you. She had forgotten the interaction entirely, but I said, I was too brusque with you. They aren't the same thing, but for all intents and purposes, in the conversation we were having, gender tracks to sex so closely that we don't need to be super, super careful about distinguishing between the two. And I wouldn't say, that was probably in like 2005, 2006. At this point, the fact that gender is like the behavioral manifestation of what sex you are has become incredibly important as a delineation for people. And that's fair and that's true. And I also have seen with my own eyes that some people really do describe themselves and really do struggle with, this language is, a lot of people don't like it, but like having been born in the wrong body. Like, really, really understand that they are, say, XX chromosomally, and they have a uterus and they are producing eggs, and they are female. They weren't assigned female at birth, but they are female, and yet something about their development, their brain, assures them 100% that they are male, and that the only way that they are going to be able to live a life that feels productive and honest is to live and transition as much as possible and to live as male. And I respect that, and I have seen the pain that people live with if they have that. And the vast majority of people who are claiming to be trans aren't that. And it's cosplay and it's LARPing, and it is destructive of our ability to have a conversation, and it helps no one and harms a lot of people. So like all of that, the fact that I was really close with my students, that I did these long field trips, and that even every quarter pretty much we did at least a week or two. So I would sit around with campfires with students a lot and get to know them well. And it's pretty easy in a group of, one-on-one or 1-on-5 or 1-on-15 to push back against silly gender ideology while still respecting that there's, a trans person in the group, for instance, who is real and, doing their best. But that the dude who wants to wear a dress, no, sorry, you're not a woman. That's not sufficient. That's not what this is. And you don't get to come into the women's bathroom, and, I'll call you what you want, but I'm not going to pretend that something is true that isn't. So I don't know. I think it's been hard for social media, anyone on social media, to come after me exactly on this topic because I had no presence early in this conversation in social media. Like I literally came online on Twitter in whatever it was, like May, June of 2017. And I had already had enough difficult conversations with students, some of whom I really think were legitimately trans, and some of whom were exploring identity and really weren't. And they let me, we were able to have these conversations that were difficult, in which I said things like, I just don't think you are. I just think that your understanding of what woman is or what man is actually regressive and, harking back to stereotypes rather than about an actual evolutionary understanding of what male and female are. And it was easier for me in person because this is literally what I was teaching. And this is what students had signed up to take from me. Like, oh, we're going to study animal behavior. We're going to study sexual selection. We're going to study, mate choice and mating systems or invertebrate evolution. And, talk about the fact that occasionally a Komodo dragon will switch sex, and be able to produce offspring without having a male around. Like, that's amazing, and we can also explain why. And we're not Komodo dragons, and we're not reef fish, and we're not all these other things. We are humans, and we have very particular constraints. And let's talk about all the exceptions and all also of like the individual pains and emotions that you as an individual have. But under no circumstances am I going to pretend. I'm just not going to pretend. Like I will honor what you feel to be true about yourself in my speaking about you and to you, but I'm not going to pretend that A is B or B is A. I'm not gonna. Mm-hmm. And it always worked in person, so it mostly works on social media too, except that anonymity and giant audiences tweak that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean there's a bunch of issues there. One of which is that I think that people do like to confuse um non-humans with humans when they start talking about these issues. And like you said, it's like, well, we're not kimono dragons. Like we're
Yes.
not clownfish. So um but I think that I sort of wonder how we came to this place where we started to believe, I'm saying we, but of course I don't believe this, you don't believe this, where we started to believe that biological sex wasn't a real material thing. I mean, in some ways, it seems to me that there's a lot of that had to do with a conflation between gender and sex. So people
Mhm.
will say sex when they mean gender. So they'll say, well, this person identifies with, essentially what they're describing is identifying with a sex role. So they're saying this person identifies more with femininity or masculinity,
Mhm.
therefore they're a man or a woman. And I'll try to explain, like, I'm not talking about gender roles. Like, I'm not talking about how you feel or what your personality is or like what kinds of clothes you like to wear. Like, that's all fine with me. Wear whatever clothes you want, be who you are. Great. What I'm talking about is the physical aspect, the biological aspect. And it's strange that people aren't, I don't know if it's that they're not able to differentiate or if they're unwilling to differentiate, because then it leads them into a conversation they don't want to have. What do you think about that aspect?
I think, I mean, just like where you started, this, believe the science. Very rarely when people say that, do they actually know how to think scientifically, or are they actually referring to real science? They're referring to the authority of someone who calls himself a scientist, and they may or may not be, who has
Hmm.
declared something. And I mean, this is the way of authoritarians, right? It's not the way of scientists. And there are a lot of scientists doing this now. There are a lot of scientists who would like to be able to do their work in private and then make a declaration and not have any pushback against it. But that's not the way science works. And the sort of the public nature of all of our discourse now does make this harder. And there's been a lot of discussion about this, for instance, with doctors. Like, oh my God, patients come in the door and they've Googled up what their symptoms are. And now they've got a diagnosis, and I got to tell them, no, it's not right, because Google did not actually go to med school, right? I both feel for the doctors and I totally feel for the patients in that scenario, right? Because going to med school isn't sufficient, but it's supposed to have been, right? Like, you're supposed to be an excellent diagnostician that you learned through iterative, diagnosis and learning, a combination of book learning and learning from patients and all of this. And most of our educational systems, including med school, are flawed enough that they become these like litanies of memory games, right? Like, I've memorized a list of symptoms that means X. And if that's really what you're doing, then how isn't Google as good? I'm not sure that it's not, right? So there are still amazing diagnosticians out there. There are still amazing doctors out there, but there are a whole lot of doctors that aren't any good. And I'm going to say the same thing for scientists. There's still amazing scientists out there. And there are a whole lot of scientists who are doing work that when I look at it, I say, sorry, not science. That's authoritarian bullshit that doesn't remind me of science. And I don't care if you have a PhD in something that's a science, it doesn't make you a scientist. It makes you credentialed. And don't mistake the credential for actually being able to think through, what have I observed? What are the possible explanations for the thing I've observed? What would be true if this possible explanation is true, and this one, and this one, and this one? How do I discriminate between these explanations, which we call hypotheses? How would I test between those hypotheses? And let me do that, or hopefully someone else does it, and come back and say, all but one of those hypotheses for the thing I observed has been falsified. Therefore, the thing that remains is most likely to be true. That's what science is. It's not the conclusion, and it's not the person who delivers it to you. I used to, every single program that I taught when I was a college professor, I started with a philosophy of science lecture. And, basically a question of epistemology, which just means, how is it that we make claims of truth? How is it that we understand what is true, and on what basis are we making those claims? And I would generally start with a picture of, or asking students, like, what makes a person a scientist? And very rarely would students give me these glib answers, but I would say, well, don't you need a lab coat? Don't you need glassware? Don't you need beakers? And, certainly you need a degree. And like, no, you don't need any of those things, of course. And that was never the kind of scientist I was. And, the fact is that many children are natural scientists and they kind of have it driven out of them. And most adults now haven't thought scientifically for a long time because they've just been fed this like authoritarian, no, if I said it, I'm the authority, believe me. The WHO says masks aren't useful, then masks must not be useful. Oh, the WHO says masks are important, well, masks must be important. Wait a minute. How can the WHO have these two totally inconsistent positions within weeks of one another,
What's
right?
the science?
Because trust the science. Wait, but not us before, only when we're right, and we're always right. Like so you can't do it that way, right? Like you can't live life that way, but it's much more exhausting to try to question everything. And I actually really do feel like the vast majority of people have the capacity to do it, but almost no one has practiced doing it because modern schooling and modern workplaces prefer people who aren't questioning things. It's irritating. It takes longer. It takes, someone always with their hand in the air means that we're not going to get through the lesson plan and, get to the testing in time to, get through the state mandated tests. And, it's a whole other question, but it's messier and harder to predict when people are taking you down rabbit holes and asking questions, but you end up understanding a whole lot more about the world and how it works and how you would assess for yourself. So trust the science. Question the scientists for sure. And when there are when something is actually a scientific theory as opposed to a hypothesis, that is us as scientists saying this has stood the test of time and testing so much that we collectively would be shocked if this got overturned. Tectonic drift, the movement of the continents, selection, natural selection, right? Like evolution by natural selection, the description of the elements in the periodic table. Like these things are not going to be overturned. I would put a lot of money on those things, but there's a whole lot else that we're still trying to figure out. And some of the things we're pretty sure of right now are going to turn out we were wrong about. And that's the way of science. And so, trust the science is often the stand-in, meaning trust the authority figure, which is anti-scientific. So it's kind of a strangely anti-scientific hashtag, right? Like hashtag trust the science. You've just revealed that you're pretty much not scientifically literate.
Yeah, for sure. So as far as the science goes, what's the difference between men and women? I know that's a very complicated conversation, but I want to start with biologically, the basic stuff,
Yeah.
What's the difference? How can we tell who's a woman and who's a man?
Yeah, the fundamental difference, like if anyone goes out into the field and discovers a new species on this planet, and they're trying to figure out whether or not they've got something that's sexually reproducing or asexual, there are a few clades that do some really weird other stuff. So like fungus has a bunch of mating types, but within plants and animals, there are sexually reproducing, occasionally clonal, but sexually reproducing. If you ascertain that you're sexually reproducing, which humans clearly are, how is it that you know that you're looking at a female versus a male? It's about the gametes. It's about the sex cells. If this organism is producing, has produced, might produce, will produce, all of these caveats about like, what about sterile people? What about postmenopausal people? Like, forget it, right? Like if this person or organism of whatever sort is producing gametes that are full of cytoplasm and big for sex cells and stay in place, they're sessile in the language of science, they're female. And if this individual organism is producing gametes, they're tiny, stripped down. All they have basically is DNA and a motor, and they are males. And in animals, we call those eggs and sperm. And in plants, we call it eggs and pollen. Pollen and sperm are the same type of gamete. They're stripped down. They have none of the cytoplasm. They have no cellular machinery. And why? Like, so in part, there's two things. If you're sexually reproducing and you're in a bisexually reproducing species, which again, all plants and animals who are sexually reproducing have two sexes, there's two things you got to do. You have to get two gametes together, so they have to find each other, right? And once they're together, you need more than just DNA. You actually need the cellular stuff. Like you need the mitochondria and the ribosomes and the other stuff of the cell in order to get that DNA to then start replicating and dividing and turning into a zygote and an embryo and an adult. So those two problems are solved by having one and only one of the gametes have all of the cytoplasm. And it just happens to be the one we call the female. And so, most people have heard of like mitochondrial Eve, mitochondrial DNA. We inherit all of our mitochondrial DNA from our matriline, from our mother's line, precisely because eggs have mitochondria and sperm doesn't. We don't get any mitochondria from our fathers. So mitochondria in every single male animal on the planet dies out with that male. He passes on none of his mitochondria because sperm don't have it. And so, okay, so you've precluded an argument between gametes where you've got an egg and a sperm, both of them bringing some mitochondria to the table, and they're kind of arguing about who's going to be primal, who's going to be primary rather. It's like, nope, egg brings mitochondria, egg brings all of the cytoplasm. The only thing the sperm is bringing is DNA. And then the other problem is, how do you find each other? Well, the egg is now bringing all this stuff. It's big and heavy, not in the general scheme of things, but in the scheme of like cells, it's a really big cell. It's going to stay in place. And it's going to, often emit some sort of signals about where it is, but the sperm's going to find it. So the sperm is this search and find mission. It's stripped down. It's got no weight to it. It's got a motor. It moves fast. It's the finding gamete, and it brings nothing but DNA. Eggs are the sit in place and, bring all of the stuff that is necessary for life except the other half of the DNA. And together they can form a zygote. And no, you can't extrapolate from that to like how adult men and women should be behaving. Like, no, that's not how it works. But there is, an initial difference in investment. Like an egg is just a much bigger investment at the level of like contribution to the initial reproductive event because sperm are tiny by comparison. So, that's the most fundamental difference is gametes. All the rest of it is gravy. Like mammals have chromosomal sex determination, cool. So do birds, different evolution. But it's not XX versus XY that makes us female and male. That it happens to be accurate descriptive for mammals, but the gametes is much more primary. It's much more fundamental. It's much older.
And how do we talk about the question of brain sex? Like if you come from a feminist background, you'll hear over and over and over again that there's no such thing as brain sex. There's no such thing as a male brain versus a female brain. But I'm not sure how accurate that is.
Yeah, I don't think it is accurate. And when I say that, I don't mean that you can always 100% on like autopsy or something say that's definitely a male brain and that's definitely a female brain. Like it's not that clear cut. But just like, just to take it out of anything that really anyone is upset by for the moment, we can acknowledge that men and women are on average different heights, right? And it used to be, I don't actually know what the current numbers are, but it used to be in the US, average male height was like, I don't even know in metric because I'm a stupid American, but it's like 5'10".
That's how we do it here too.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
We're probably not supposed to, but that's how we do it.
it's ridiculous. We're ridiculous, but there we are. So like average male height is like 5'10". Average female height is 5'5". I don't actually know if those numbers are current. They were current at some point. And that does not mean either that all men are 5'10" and all women are 5'5", nor does it mean that all men are taller than all women. You've got these like, it's a distribution, it's a normal distribution. It's just like it's a bell curve, and they're overlapping. They don't have a chalkboard or anything, but you've got these normal distributions that actually overlap, such that sure, your really tall friend Rhonda does not put the lie to the fact that on average men are taller than women. And so if we take that argument, which is just sort of basic what's called descriptive statistics, in which you describe a population with numbers rather than try to infer what it means, which is in the realm of like p-values and such. But if we take that like simple descriptive statistics explanation over into brains, we say, well, there are differences between male and female brains on average. Things like, and I forgot to look it up, so I don't remember which way it goes, but either men or women tend to have more white matter. and the other has more gray matter. And this is a measure of like how many of the neurons are actually coded in myelin, which speeds the transmission of synaptic messages. And one isn't better than the other. They're good at different tasks. And this I think that the fear that if we're talking over in sex and gender space, that it's often, we women are worried like, oh, this conversation is going to get ugly and it's going to reveal that, we're not as smart or we're not as this. We're not like, you know what? Different. And different does not mean worse. Different also doesn't mean better. Under some conditions, what women are great at on average is going to be better suited to some tasks. And in some conditions, what men are better at on average are going to be better suited to some tasks. And some women are going to be awesome at male typical tasks and maybe better at them than any man they've ever met. But that doesn't mean that on average, most men are better than women at those kinds of tasks. And so that, they include things like, interests, which may then move into actual ability, although there's less solid evidence for this. So like even from birth, tiny babies, male babies are much more interested in looking at things, and female babies are more interested in looking at people and faces. And, do those differences in interests, which seem to be on board before there's any acculturation, then translate into pursuing things, pursuing more thing-like interests and pursuing more people or social-like interests? Probably. And does that then create more ability in one versus the other space? Probably. And is any of that genetic? Not necessarily, actually. But male versus female is real, and male brains and female brains are different on average. And probably a little bit of that brain difference could be tracked back to some heritable difference, which probably means genetic, but it doesn't mean it's your fate. It doesn't mean if you're male, you can't be caring and compassionate. And if you're female, you can't be good at fixing engines, obviously. There's nothing in any of that about describing populations of men versus populations of women, that has anything to say about what you or I or any individual man or woman can do or aspire to. We all have different skills and abilities, and we're all going to be good at different stuff, and the population level differences can help us predict what we might be better at. But that's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, what feminists are concerned about, obviously, is that sex stereotypes, gender, will limit what women are permitted to do, essentially, because it has in the past. It has been, literally like women are too delicate to be involved in politics or public life, or too emotional or too irrational or whatever it is. So feminism has naturally in many ways rejected gender, to the point where some feminists will say, abolish gender, we don't need it. And I've said that, I've said things like, I don't really think we need to talk about masculinity and femininity, because as much as, I know that evolution is real, and it makes sense to me that women might be more inclined towards specific tasks or behaviors because of those things. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, so the way that I can discuss this is obviously going to be less articulate than the way others might be able to. But at the same time, it sounds like gender is real in some ways. It's just not applicable to every individual. It's as most things are, a more complex conversation where we can say, women are more likely to be inclined towards these skills or these tasks or these behaviors. But that doesn't mean it doesn't, not all women, I'm a woman who's never wanted to have children before. I still don't want to have children.
Yeah.
It doesn't make me not a woman. And I'm feminine in other ways, like I have masculine traits, feminine traits. It's complex. And on both ends, I think that people get too caught up in, no, we need gender. Gender is really important. Men and women should be in their roles because that's what's natural, versus like there's no such thing as gender at all. And if you talk about gender as real or innate, you're a sexist.
Right. No, I think you've nailed it, and that both extremes are ignoring something real. So I grew up. We talked a little bit before going on air, and I'm about 10 years older than you. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and it was a time of vast opportunity. Like it was a time of vast opportunity for girls, and I really always felt like everything is on offer. Like I can do anything, and it feels like some of what is happening right now, a there's going to be a backlash that is regressive, and like I do think a lot of the trans rights activist ideology and languaging is regressive and sexist and misogynistic for sure. But I also think so many people who aren't that, who don't have that on board, are listening to this and getting fed up, and their reaction is going to be, let's just go back to how it was. And like if how it was is like Mad Men, like 1950s traditional housewife, like there's a whole lot of us who are not going to put up with that, like not interested, never going there, never lived it, like never saw it as a viable, as an active lived life, actually. Although I'm sure other people in the 70s and 80s did see that, but I was lucky. I didn't have that in my home,
Mm-hmm.
and none of my friends did. And it never occurred to me that gosh, 40 years later, there are still going to be people who are legitimately arguing that we should be going back to women being in the kitchen and barefoot and only cooking cooking and raising kids. Like I didn't see that coming. Like that's actually totally shocking to me. And I do. I said earlier in our conversation here that I have a very hard time calling myself a feminist now. I always used to. Like I was a subscriber to the very first issue of Ad Free Ms. Like this was how I lived. I was so excited to be away from advertisers getting to drive editorial content for women's magazines and not for anyone else, and and trying to figure out how it is that we could be have equal opportunity without pretending to be the same. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's it, right? Like that's what I thought feminism was about, and that's certainly how my mom and her business partner and best friend, who was also a woman, appeared to be living their lives. And frankly, my father, who was awesome, saw that too. And never expected anything different of me because I was a girl. And that was what I thought the future was that we were moving towards. And I'm shocked to find a lot of confusion in the discourse now around in which women who are trying to live our fullest lives without sexist stereotypes are occasionally having fingers pointed at us as if we're the ones who dragged the conversation back into the sort of 1950s dark ages. And like, no, that's not what happened.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what all happened, but it wasn't the people, it wasn't Mary Tyler Moore, right? Like that was a hopeful future.
Yeah, it's strange because I mean, people are pointing fingers in all sorts of directions. I find that a lot of people, I consistently get comments on my website, for example, from men who will say, "This is your fault, feminists. You asked for this because this is, I suppose, what they would say, we destroyed gender roles and we wanted to be equal to men. So now here you are in the brave new world where like sex doesn't mean anything and a man can be a woman and vice versa." And I've thought about that. I'm like, is this partly feminism's fault? And I don't think that that's true because feminism has always fought against gender roles and argued that, of course, women don't have to be tied to these stereotypes and that they shouldn't be limited by those stereotypes. And same thing for men too. I do think that maybe there could be some blame if we wanted to, blame somebody, which is always the most helpful way to deal with problems is to find somebody to point the finger at. But, gender studies, which is, of course, what women's studies became. But I feel that this is all sort of lacking understanding of the women's movement and how the women's movement progressed, because my understanding of feminism was always more rooted in second wave feminism. And
That's
then
right.
third wave feminism came along, and it was an entirely different beast. And what was women's studies really stopped being about women and started being more about, I guess, I don't know, I guess you could call it queer studies, or, postmodernism, I suppose.
Yep.
Um, and, so yeah, people act as though there's only those two options. Like, it's like, well, now you have to choose like trad wife, which is something I just learned about this
Oh boy.
year. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, well, I don't want that. Or you have to accept this new world where there's no such thing as a man or a woman, and anybody can be anything they want.
Yeah.
Um, I guess, I mean, I'm like, where am I going with this? But I sort of am wondering what your, I have issues with feminism. I've always had issues with third wave feminism. Now I have issues with all sorts of aspects of feminism. But you find yourself at odds with some aspects of feminism today, as I understand it.
Mhm.
Which aspects?
I suspect that the overlap with of the issues that I have with it and that you is very, very close. That I grew up with women who were basically second wave feminists as role models, and it made a lot of sense. And since I've become aware, I don't think it was really, I don't know at what point third wave feminism got the title, but since sort of the early '90s, since I was in college and I was seeing this ideology in, I wasn't anthropology, I was a literature major and then an anthropology major, and then my graduate work's in biology. But even in the social sciences, even in anthropology, I saw this sort of, the gender studies, queer studies ideology as distinct from women's studies. That really, I think you're right, I think that is the demarcation between like third wave and second wave feminism that was being trotted out, and it just didn't make any sense. And what it seemed to me to be was reality denying. Like, it seemed like it was denying just fundamentals of biology. And at that point, when I was 20, I couldn't have given you the answer I did about gametes being the fundamental difference between male and female. But I knew that mammals are, named for our eponymous character, which is mammary glands, and that with the mammary glands also come, at least in the roughly half of the mammals that are placental mammals, long periods of gestation in a uterus, and that it's not sexist to say that. It's just true, right? Like, it's just true. And the fact of gestation and lactation in any female mammal that chooses to have a child of their own, that they don't adopt, and adoption does actually happen in some other species, but obviously the vast majority of children are raised by mothers or couples who are, in which the child was cooked inside the mom. That is going to have an effect on what the adult women in a population can do, because it takes, you're not going to go out whale hunting when you're pregnant. And, I don't know anyone who goes out whale hunting, but there are certainly cultures where whale hunting is a thing. And so I use that example both because it's funny, but because there's this just amazing study that I bring up a lot from 1973, I think it is. It's these two anthropologists, I think they're both women, if memory serves, Provost and Murdoch. And what they have done is, it's 73, and they've gone and looked back from then at all of this other anthropological literature on 50, I think it is. No, it's like 85 cultures, pre-industrial cultures, and they've coded for 50 tasks and said, for each of these tasks, is it only the women who do it? Is it only the men who do it? Is it not gendered at all? Is it mostly men? Is it mostly women? So like 5, all the way from only men to only women. And they don't include things that are physiologically mandated, like gestation, like lactation, right? But they include all sorts of other things, like whale hunting, like basket weaving, like water getting, like fire starting, like, ore smelting, log destroying, that's not the right word, but cooking of vegetal foods versus cooking of animal foods, like just a lot of behaviors, a lot of activities that are important for some number of pre-industrial cultures. And obviously not every pre-industrial culture has like whale hunting, but some of them do. And this paper is fascinating to me because it's got this one page of summary of all of the data, and I could just spend hours and hours looking at it, but it's got a few activities, a very few, that really, in those cultures where it is done at all, only men do it. And whale hunting is one of them. And it's hunting of marine mammals, so it includes seals, I guess. And iron smelting is another one. And timbering is close, cutting down trees is another one that's almost entirely male. And it makes sense. And I'm not saying that in a modern time, a woman who's like, I'm not getting pregnant and I'm not going to be breastfeeding a baby and I want to go out and hunt whales. I mean, I don't know who is making that decision right now, but like, okay, you can do that. But in any era before birth control, like, this doesn't make sense. Like, you're not going to have women who are training as girls to go out and do these sorts of things where, they're not going to be as capable if they're pregnant or breastfeeding. They're going to be putting their kid at risk. They're going to be putting everyone else in the boat at risk. Like, it's just not, it doesn't make sense as a decision for either the individual woman or for any of the people in the culture. So there's a few of those, just a few, right? And then there are a whole lot of activities that are, usually it's women who do it, but some cultures it's men. And things, the ones that are most gendered in the female direction are things like preparing of vegetal foods and getting water. But the vast majority of activities across all of these societies that these researchers looked at, which just went back into the literature, are either not gendered at all in the vast majority of societies where they looked at, or, and this is what I find super fascinating, they are gendered, but it depends on the culture which gender does it. So something like, and again, I didn't go back and look at it for today, but I think, for instance, I think weaving, like weaving of yarns, is one of these things that in most cultures that they looked at, where weaving is a thing that people do, it is highly gendered, but in some of those cultures, only men do it and women are forbidden from doing it. And in some cultures, only women do it and men are forbidden from doing it. And to me, that's just like, that right there is how we know that we can get into the future in a way that makes sense for all of us, because division of labor does make sense. Like, it is valuable. But relying on outdated stereotypes doesn't. And we can have things that are gendered without it being about inherent differences, but without it signifying inherent differences in ability between men and women. Like, there are lots of things that have been gendered in the past that don't mean anything about, like, oh, well, men are just better at dealing with yarn. Really, over there, but over here, women are better? Because that doesn't make any sense. So, like, there can be value in division of labor and in gendering stuff without it saying anything about Native ability or interest. So, I love that outcome for obvious reasons.
Yeah. So when you're talking about the preparation of, what did you say, the preparation of vegetal
food. So basically,
versus the preparation of
animal foods. Yeah.
Like, I can't stop thinking about, like, how men are always responsible for barbecuing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I'm not saying they have to be, but it's like, that's almost always how it plays out. Like, the men stand around the barbecue and poke at the meat, and the women cook the other
sides. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh, did it have to be? No, it didn't have to be. And certainly there are women who man the barbecue, like, and right, like men who love to prepare salads. But yeah, that's one of these things that's actually pretty consistent across all of these other human cultures. And okay, I'm not worried about that. That's fine. Like, it's fine.
I'm not interested in the barbecue. Like, I've never totally understood why. Now it all makes sense. But I've always been like, I don't know how to turn on a I don't want to touch the meat. Like, I'll go prepare, like, the cheese plate. I don't know. Right. But men seem to enjoy that kind of thing. And I guess now we know why.
That's right.
Because it's part of their biology. I'm joking. Okay, so I'll let you go soon. I know you got to get out of here. One last really small question. If you were in charge of feminism, if you were in charge of feminism today, what would you say the focus should be on, as opposed to perhaps some of the directions that it's gone in or is going in right now?
Oh boy. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. I guess it's been a while since I tried to figure out what I think feminism means now. So, I think of myself as an egalitarian at this point, without, because it's a non-political word rather than a feminist. I want to reclaim that word. And I used to refer to the third wave feminists as faux feminists, like FAUX, French faux feminists.
Yeah. I kind of did
And
that too. I spent a long time refusing to acknowledge them as feminists and saying, this is the real feminism. That's not even feminism. And now I'm just like, well, nobody knows what anybody's talking about, so I can't do that anymore.
Yeah, it didn't stick. And maybe a few of us can start doing that again and see if it works. But there are still battles to be had, and making sure, for instance, that the fact of our different biology doesn't preclude us, for instance, from career advancement. And this is my dog's in the background shaking, so sorry about the noise. The answers aren't simple, though. So I'm thinking about specifically like the fact of the system I know best, academia, where early in your career, which is exactly when women are at their most reproductive, and if they do want to have families, they're most likely to be having families, is exactly when you have to be publishing the most, going to the most conferences, the most active, the most out there, not prioritizing anything else. And the idea of doing, taking 6 months off or a year off or, a year and a half off in order to actually be, a full-time mother for just the very earliest stage of your kid's life is unthinkable. And I don't think that we should, it doesn't make any sense to be like, oh, just, take 18 years off and we'll save your space for you. Like that, that's not the way our brains work. That's not the way systems work. But there are still some barriers in place that make it harder for women to try to do both in a way that it doesn't require that the explanation doesn't have to include men were trying to put us down, because the fact that men don't have these constraints is just a fact of their biology as well. Right. And the fact that in the 1950s, male academics tended to have a wife at home who was a stay-at-home mom, who was tending the house and the finances and everything else, and that's what made it possible for him to do his work, be it academic or politics or whatever it was, has helped create these systems that now expect like full-time, all the time on, 24/7 lifestyle, when frankly very few people of either sex at this point have a full-time helper, right? Like very few people have a 1950s style housewife waiting for them at home, taking care of everything, waiting with a hot dinner and their slippers when they get home, right? And I find hope in that I don't run into very many people who at least will say out loud that that's what they want, right? Like because it's not a relationship of equals, and it can be really, I hear that it can be good for both people, but it's nothing that I have seen directly, and I have never wanted to be part of such a relationship or a system that encouraged it, precisely because once that is encouraged, it makes it very much harder for single people or, basically anyone who's not in one of these, relationships with a trad wife, as you say, to use that word, to get the work done. So, reducing barriers to success for people who would like to both have their intellectual life, their creative life, their physical life, whatever it is, and maybe also have a family, is going to be it's going to be harder for women than for men. And I think society owes us all some ways to make that happen. And I say that with the understanding that it's hard, that, again, just to use academia, which is the system I know best, you have to be current in order to contribute the most. And if you really just step outside of whatever your research is fully for even 6 months, there's a good chance that when you step back in, you will have missed something truly important. And, how is it that we can just guarantee you'll 100% be able to step back in? Well, there has to be some time limit on it. And that isn't inherently, fair. But the fact is, we're not identical. We should be treated as equally as possible without ever pretending that we are identical. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's the tagline for the feminism that I want. Treated as identically as possible, treated as equally as possible without pretending that we're identical or have identical interests and aspirations and even skills.
Yeah, that's great. I agree with you. It was so great to talk with you. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope
Yeah,
that
me
we
too.
can do it again. And that, yeah, I hope that someday we'll be able to meet in person.
I would love that. That would be great. We're not so far from one another. Not that you could tell in this era of COVID, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Once we're allowed to travel again, it won't be so difficult. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Megan.
Bye.